When a 9-year-old boy raised his hand in a Harvard lecture hall, the professor scoffed until the child solved a 30-year-old impossible math problem. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The prestigious Harvard lecture hall buzzed with anticipation as undergraduate students filled the rows, joined by several visiting high school students and their parents. The university had opened this particular advanced mathematics lecture to exceptional young minds as part of their outreach program. Among the visitors sat Ethan, a bright-eyed 9-year-old boy who fidgeted excitedly in his seat between his mother, Sarah, and his father, Dr. James Collins, a mathematics professor from a neighboring university. At the front of the room stood Professor Richard Harrington, a distinguished figure in his 60s with silver hair, stern features, and spectacles perched on his nose. His reputation preceded him, brilliant, demanding, and notoriously dismissive of those he deemed intellectually inferior. Today, he wrote a complex equation on the board with deliberate strokes of chalk. "Ladies and gentlemen," Professor Harrington began, his voice commanding immediate silence. "What you see before you is what we call in advanced mathematics a Diophantine equation. For 30 years, the solution to this particular variant has eluded the greatest minds in our field." He gestured dramatically at the equation, stepping back to let the audience absorb its complexity. The formula stretched across the board in an intimidating array of symbols, exponents, and variables. I've presented this problem at conferences worldwide. Mathematicians from MIT, Oxford, and the Sorbonne have all attempted solutions. All have failed. He clasped his hands behind his back and surveyed the room with an air of superiority. I bring it to you today, not with the expectation that anyone here will solve it, but to demonstrate the beautiful complexity that mathematics can reach, problems so intricate that they may well be impossible to solve with our current understanding. Dr. Collins leaned over to whisper something to his wife, but before he could speak, Ethan's small hand shot into the air. Sarah gently tried to lower her son's arm, embarrassed by his presumption in such a setting. "Ethan, no," she whispered, urgently. "This is a university-level lecture." But Professor Harrington had already noticed. His eyebrows arched high above his spectacles as he stared at the child. "Well," he said with barely concealed amusement, "we have an eager young participant. Yes, young man. Do you have a question about the concept of impossibility, perhaps?" The audience chuckled, and Ethan's cheeks flushed pink, but his hand remained steadily raised. "I think I see a way to solve it," Ethan said, his voice small but clear in the suddenly silent hall. Professor Harrington's smile froze. "Do you now?" he replied, glancing at Dr. Collins with a look that clearly questioned his parenting decisions. "Perhaps you'd like to share your insights with the class?" Dr. Collins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, torn between protecting his son from inevitable embarrassment and supporting his courage. Sarah squeezed Ethan's hand in silent support, though her expression betrayed her concern. Ethan rose from his seat, a small figure in a sea of adults. As he made his way to the front of the lecture hall, whispers and subtle laughter rippled through the audience. Professor Harrington stepped aside with theatrical courtesy, extending an arm toward the chalkboard. "The floor is yours, young man," he said, his tone condescending. "Please enlighten Harvard's mathematics department." Ethan stood before the massive board, having to reach up to write on it. Professor Harrington offered him a wooden step stool from behind the lectern, which only emphasized how out of place the boy appeared. "Thank you," Ethan said softly, taking the chalk from the professor's outstretched hand. For a moment, the boy just stared at the equation, his eyes moving back and forth across the symbols. The audience grew restless, and Professor Harrington cleared his throat, prepared to gently but firmly end what was becoming an uncomfortable situation. "Perhaps this is a bit advanced after all," the professor began, You've approached it as a standard Diophantine problem, Ethan interrupted, his voice suddenly stronger. But I think it needs to be reframed using modular arithmetic. Professor Harrington's mouth closed with an audible click. Behind Ethan, Dr. Collins straightened in his seat, his expression shifting from embarrassment to intense focus. Ethan began writing on the board, his small hand moving with surprising confidence. He didn't erase the professor's equation, but instead created a new set of expressions beneath it. His handwriting was childish but clear, and the mathematical notation, though unpolished, followed proper form. If we consider this variable within a finite field, Ethan explained, pointing to a specific part of the equation, we can transform the problem from an impossibility to something solvable through a different framework. The lecture hall had fallen completely silent. Professor Harrington stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he followed the boy's work. Several graduate students in the front row leaned forward in their seats, notebooks forgotten. Ethan continued for nearly 10 minutes, breaking down the problem and reconstructing it through a completely unexpected approach. He occasionally paused, erased a symbol, and replaced it with another, muttering corrections to himself. And then, he said, writing a final line of equations. We can verify that this satisfies all the original constraints. He turned to face Professor Harrington, offering the chalk back to him. I think this works, but I might have made some arithmetic errors in the calculations. Professor Harrington didn't take the chalk. Instead, he stood motionless, staring at the board with an expression of disbelief. The silence stretched uncomfortably until a graduate student in the front row stood up. He's right, the student said, voice filled with awe. He's actually right. Look at how he transformed the third coefficient. It's brilliant. Professor Harrington finally moved, taking the chalk from Ethan's outstretched hand. He turned to the board and traced through the work with his finger, occasionally murmuring to himself. The audience watched in collective anticipation. After what seemed an eternity, the professor turned to face Ethan. The condescension had vanished from his expression, replaced by something between shock and respect. Young man, Professor Harrington said slowly, where did you learn this approach? Ethan shrugged. I read a lot of math books, and sometimes problems look different to me than how adults see them. Dr. Collins had made his way to the front of the room and placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. Ethan has always had a unique way of seeing mathematical relationships, he explained. We didn't know he would understand this level of problem, though. Professor Harrington nodded thoughtfully. I've been teaching mathematics for 40 years, he said, addressing the entire hall now. And I have been proven wrong today in the most extraordinary way. He looked down at Ethan with newfound respect. This young man has demonstrated something I've tried to convey for decades. Mathematics requires not just knowledge, but imagination. The professor turned to the audience, his demeanor transformed. What we've witnessed today is a powerful lesson. Never declare something impossible merely because established methods have failed, and never underestimate where brilliant insight might come from. The weeks following Ethan's unexpected breakthrough unfolded in a whirlwind of activity and attention. The Collins family found themselves thrust into an academic spotlight they had never anticipated. Dr. James Collins had always known his son possessed extraordinary mathematical abilities, but even he had been stunned by Ethan's intuitive grasp of concepts that had eluded professional mathematicians for decades. Sarah Collins, though immensely proud, worried about protecting her son's childhood amid the growing interest from academic institutions, media outlets, and even private sector research firms. 1 month after the lecture hall incident, the Collins family made their way across Harvard Yard, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. The historic buildings of America's oldest university loomed around them, their weathered brick facades witness to centuries of intellectual breakthroughs. Today would mark another milestone, though unlike most academic achievements celebrated. Within these walls, this one centered around a boy who still watched cartoons on Saturday mornings and collected dinosaur figurines. "Are you nervous?" Sarah asked, adjusting Ethan's collar as they approached the mathematics department building. The boy had insisted on wearing his favorite blue bow tie, claiming it made him feel more mathematical. Ethan shook his head, his eyes taking in the campus with curiosity rather than intimidation. "Not really. Professor Harrington isn't as scary as he seems." Dr. Collins laughed softly. "I'm not sure all his graduate students would agree with that assessment." They were led to a conference room far removed from the grand lecture hall where Ethan had first made his mark. This space was intimate, with warm wood paneling and large windows overlooking a courtyard where students hustled between classes. Around an oval table sat Professor Harrington and 5 colleagues from the mathematics department, each regarded as a luminary in their respective specializations. Behind them stood 2 representatives from the university administration, their presence indicating the institutional significance of this meeting. On the polished table lay several copies of the Journal of Advanced Mathematical Theory, opened. To a paper titled Alternative Approaches to Diophantine Complexity, a new framework for previously unsolvable equations. Listed as co-authors were Professor Richard Harrington, Ph.D., and Ethan Collins. The juxtaposition of credentials, or lack thereof, would have been amusing if not for the revolutionary content the paper contained. Professor Harrington rose as they entered, his demeanor markedly different from the condescending academic who had invited a child to the blackboard a month earlier. There was respect in his eyes now, perhaps even a trace of humility that his colleagues found both surprising and refreshing. "The Collins family," he said warmly, extending his hand first to James, then Sarah, and finally to Ethan, whom he addressed with the same professional courtesy he would offer a peer. "Thank you for coming. Please be seated." Once everyone had settled, Professor Harrington began the formal proceedings. "The solution has been verified by 3 independent teams," he announced, tapping the journal before him. "Cambridge, Princeton, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton have all confirmed the validity of the approach. More remarkably, 2 of these teams have already begun applying similar methodologies to other previously intractable problems with promising initial results." A woman at the far end of the table, Professor Eleanor Weiss, whose work on number theory had earned her the Fields Medal a decade earlier, leaned forward. "What young Mr. Collins has demonstrated isn't just a solution to a single problem. It's potentially a new lens through which to view an entire class of mathematical challenges. The implications for number theory alone are substantial, but we're also seeing potential applications in cryptography and computational complexity theory." Sarah squeezed Ethan's hand beneath the table. Though she couldn't follow all the technical terminology, the profound respect in Professor Weiss's voice told her everything she needed to know about the significance of her son's contribution. "More importantly," Professor Harrington continued, "we've convened today to discuss Ethan's future. With the permission of the university president and the full support of the mathematics department, we'd like to offer Ethan a unique opportunity. We're establishing a special mentorship program that would allow him to work with our department while continuing his regular education at his own pace." He slid a folder across the table to Dr. Collins. "The program would be tailored specifically to Ethan's needs and interests. He would have access to university resources and faculty mentors, but would not be subjected to the formal pressures of traditional academic advancement. We believe this balance is crucial given his age." Sarah looked concerned, her maternal instincts immediately assessing the potential impact on her son's well-being. How would this affect his normal childhood, his friends, his other interests? Professor Weiss stepped in, her voice gentle. "An excellent question, Mrs. Collins. We've consulted with the university's developmental psychologists to design this program. Ethan would only be on campus for 2 afternoons a week, with additional virtual sessions as desired. The structure prioritizes his social development and ensures he has ample time for play, friends, and exploring interests beyond mathematics. One of the university administrators, a woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, added, "Harvard has had experience with exceptionally gifted young people before, though admittedly none quite as young as Ethan. We've learned that forcing accelerated formal education often does more harm than good. This program is about nurturing his gift, while protecting his childhood." Dr. Collins, who had been quietly reviewing the proposal, looked up. "The financial provisions are generous," he noted with surprise. The folder contained details of a substantial educational trust that would be established for Ethan, ensuring his future academic journey would be fully funded regardless of which path he chose. "The university believes in investing in extraordinary potential," Professor Harrington said simply, "and several private foundations have expressed interest in contributing to the trust once this paper gains wider circulation." Throughout this discussion, Ethan had remained silent, his legs swinging slightly beneath the table, too short to reach the floor. Now all eyes turned to him expectantly. Dr. Collins smiled at his son. "It's entirely your choice, Ethan. Whatever you decide, we support you. And you can always change your mind later if it doesn't feel right." Ethan looked around the room at the professors who had once seemed so intimidating, but now regarded him with genuine interest and respect. He considered the offer carefully with a thoughtfulness that belied his years. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I have lots of other ideas too, especially about that other problem Professor Harrington mentioned last time, the one about prime number distributions." Professor Harrington's eyebrows shot up, and he exchanged glances with Professor Weiss. The problem Ethan had casually referenced was one of the most notorious unsolved questions in modern mathematics. "I'm sure you do," Professor Harrington said, unable to suppress a chuckle. "And I, for one, can't wait to have my other impossible theories challenged. Perhaps we've all been approaching these problems with too many preconceptions." The meeting continued for another hour, discussing practical arrangements and addressing the Collins questions about how to handle potential media interest in Ethan's achievement. Harvard's public relations team had already fielded dozens of interview requests, but all agreed that Ethan's privacy and normality should be prioritized over publicity. As the discussion wound down, the group broke into smaller conversations. Sarah spoke with the psychologist about maintaining balance in Ethan's life. Dr. Collins engaged with Professor Weiss about the specific mathematical concepts his son might explore. Ethan himself had wandered to a chalkboard mounted on the wall and was quietly working through some equation, his small hand moving confidently across the green surface. Professor Harrington observed the boy for a moment before approaching. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward what Ethan was writing. Ethan nodded, stepping aside to give the professor a better view. On the board was an elegant approach to a problem tangentially related to their published work, a natural extension that even Harrington hadn't considered. "Remarkable," the professor murmured. "You know, in 40 years of teaching, I've never experienced anything quite like that day in the lecture hall." Ethan looked up, curious. "Were you very surprised?" "More than surprised," Harrington admitted. "I was transformed. Do you know what the most valuable lesson in all this was for me, young man?" Ethan shook his head. The professor knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the boy, a gesture of respect rather than condescension. "It's that sometimes the greatest barrier to discovery isn't the problem itself. It's our certainty that it can't be solved." He tapped his temple thoughtfully. "Always question the impossible. That's where breakthroughs begin." Ethan absorbed this wisdom with a solemnity that contrasted with his youth. "I just saw it differently," he said with childlike simplicity. "Exactly," said Professor Harrington, rising to his feet. "And that has made all the difference, not just for this one problem, but potentially for how we approach mathematical challenges for generations to come." As the meeting concluded and the participants prepared to leave, Dr. James Collins hung back, watching his son chatting animatedly with Professor Weiss about some mathematical concept. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Are we doing the right thing?" she whispered. "It's all happening so fast." Dr. Collins squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Look at him, Sarah. Have you ever seen him so engaged, so alive? This isn't about pushing him. It's about giving him access to people who can understand and nurture the way his mind works." Sarah nodded slowly. "I just don't want him to lose his childhood." "We won't let that happen," her husband promised. "Mathematics is part of who he is, but it's not all he is. Our job is to make sure he remembers that." As they left the building, stepping back into the autumn sunshine, Ethan ran ahead to examine a large sculpture depicting mathematical principles through artistic form. His parents watched as he circled it, alternately studying its structure and simply enjoying its beauty, a perfect metaphor for the balance they hoped to maintain in his extraordinary life. Later that evening, as the Collins family drove home, the university's iconic buildings receding in their rearview mirror, Ethan gazed out the window at the passing landscape, his mind clearly elsewhere. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Sarah asked from the front seat. Ethan turned to her, his expression brightening with childlike enthusiasm. "Do you think I could join the soccer team and do the Harvard program?" "Tyler said they need more players, and I've been practicing my kicks." Dr. Collins caught his wife's eye and smiled. For all his mathematical brilliance, Ethan was still, fundamentally, a 9-year-old boy, and they intended to keep it that way, Harvard collaboration notwithstanding. "I think that sounds like an excellent idea," Sarah said, relief evident in her voice. "Balance in all things, right?" Ethan nodded, already moving on to his next thought. "And maybe Professor Harrington could come to my science fair next month. I'm building a model of a 4-dimensional hypercube that actually rotates." His parents exchanged another glance, amused, proud, and slightly overwhelmed by the journey ahead. Their son had rewritten what was possible once. There was no telling what other impossibilities he might transform in the years to come. And somewhere back on campus, Professor Richard Harrington sat in his office, the lights of evening gathering around him as he stared at notes from a career spanning 4 decades. For the first time in years, he began erasing the word impossible wherever it appeared in his research journals and replacing it with a new notation. Not yet solved. Approach from new perspective. The most valuable lessons, after all, sometimes came from the most unexpected teachers.